Redistribution is the consolidation of low volume, often moving LTL, less than truckload product in the network. And you consolidate that into geographically optimal locations. We say we come in as a 4PL in that we don't necessarily have to operate the truck or operate the warehouse. We help you manage all those relationships on your behalf and really act as an extension of the brand to ensure that your goals and strategy are really being deployed the most effectively across the organization, across the network. And everyone is adhering to all those practices and policies. If a driver isn't happy going into a particular location to pick up or drop off product, that's going to reflect in your service and in your cost.
Welcome to Farm to Fork, the Innovators. I'm your host, David Maloney, president of Datum FS, and I've spent over 4 decades navigating the twists and turns of the food supply chain. On this podcast, we're diving deep into the stories and strategies that are reshaping the way we produce, distribute, and serve our food. Our guest innovator today is Loraine Yalch, President, National Accounts Division at Armada Supply Chain Solutions, a leading company in logistics, redistribution services, and technology within the food service supply chain sector. In this episode, we will explore the critical role of transportation and distribution in the supply chain, the current landscape of these vital segments, including the reasons behind the tightening of distribution, effective best practices in both distribution and transportation, and strategies for quickly reducing greenhouse gas emissions and overall costs within these segments. So buckle up, hit that subscribe button, and let's harvest progress together. This is Farm to Fork, the Innovators, where the future of the food supply chain starts with this episode. All right, Lorraine, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks for having me, David. So good to be here.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Loraine Yalch, president of the National Accounts Division for Armada Supply Chain Solutions. Been with Armada 23 years, which is also the period of time I've been in the food and food service space. Prior to that, come out of a civil engineering undergraduate degree and practice as an engineer for many years. So the way I look at it now is rather than helping design the roads, I help people move things on them. So all very interrelated.
Now, we talked to Debbie Gann with Armada back in the spring, and we talked about, we mostly focused on technology and the offerings and that kind of best practices and the leadership that Armada provides for the industry there. But Armada is so much bigger than that. And before we really dive into it, maybe you can, in a couple sentences, just kind of describe the breadth of Armada.
Sure.
And maybe the mission.
Sure. I'll try and do it in a couple sentences, as you said, but the breadth, that can be tricky. We are a supply chain solutions provider. We operate predominantly in the food and then multi-unit food service space. That is where our history is and really the majority of what our client base looks like. What we say in a nutshell, and it crosses a wide array of services and capabilities, but we help you gain control, calm the chaos, and reduce risk in your supply chain, and historically deliver somewhere between a 1% to 2% cost of goods reduction that is sustainable year over year of the relationship. And we do that through a wide array of capabilities. But that would be what we do in a nutshell.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And today we're going to focus, one of those is logistics.
Yes.
Right. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today here, folks. So, but before we jump in, any hobbies? We were just talking about gardening and tomatoes.
Yeah.
Right. Any other hobbies you want to enlighten us with?
Definitely gardening. I would say related to that. I love to arrange flowers and like make bouquets. Would love to have a cut flower garden at some point. Not quite there yet. And then related to the food, love to cook and anything food related. So it's nice to have sort of my personal hobbies align and intersect with what I do professionally.
Yeah, cool. And Lorraine is based in Pittsburgh, which is, as many people might know, is near and dear to my heart because that's where my wife and I were born and raised.
Yep.
So I have one last question for you on that. How long have you been there?
23 years.
You've been in Pittsburgh 23 years.
I'd have to do the math on Pittsburgh. Let me see. I came here, I did my undergraduate at University of Pittsburgh. So I came here in 1989. That's when I graduated from high school. And with the exception of an 11-year stint in Denver, I've been here that whole time. So
are you a Yinzer?
No, I am not. Neither is my husband, even though he's born and raised here.
Okay. Well, my first email address was yinzer@aol.com. Right. I look at it as like a badge of honor.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. Well, we could have a whole separate podcast on just what that means for people who are unfamiliar.
So just briefly, folks, in Pittsburgh many years ago when I was a kid, instead of saying, how are you doing, or you all, they would say, how are Yins doing? So, and you don't really find it too far outside of Pittsburgh, maybe about 100 miles, and that's about it.
Yeah.
So sometimes Pittsburghers are called Yinzers.
Yeah.
All right. So let's jump in again. Let's maybe broaden out on that breadth of Armada. I understand supply chain for mostly multi-unit food service, but you also have had a couple acquisitions over the last couple of years and broadening outside of food service. So maybe from there and then getting us back into food service, what do you offer?
Sure. Yeah. So not quite 2 years ago, Armada made its first acquisition. So we have grown organically, up until that point in our history and grown very nicely just with the restaurant brands and related suppliers that we support. But we started, we were at a point in our growth trajectory where we wanted to accelerate growth in a different way, and acquisitions are a great way to do that. And just started to look at where are there either capabilities that we outsource today to another provider because we don't have that skill set in-house, or where are there companies we can acquire that would just tuck in under services we already provide and expand our breadth and depth in that particular area. So those are really the two sort of guiding areas of focus when we look at companies that we may want to acquire. And they are also finding needles in haystacks. You have to look at a lot to find the one or two or three where you really want to move forward. So our first acquisition was Sunset Transportation, based in St. Louis. They are a 3PL brokerage. We, as Armada, manage about $1.1 billion in transportation on an annual basis. We use brokers in our network. So having a broker under the umbrella companies, we saw a lot of value in, both for us, but also for our client base. And then the second acquisition was a company called ATEC Logistics in Orlando. They are basically an ocean brokerage. So they support also very predominantly in the multi-unit food service space, and support clients with export of product from the U.S. to a good portion of the Western Hemisphere, the Middle East, South Africa. They can really support export anywhere, but that is where the majority of their lanes of supply are currently. So again, another great sort of tool in the toolkit. We do support our clients with international, both on the import and the export side. So bringing that capability in-house, we saw a lot of value in, especially with their commonality in operating very extensively in multi-unit food service. So those two have really complemented, a broad breadth of capabilities. You mentioned speaking with Debbie in the spring around technology capabilities that are everything from core supply chain visibility platforms that just let brands get a handle on all my product data, all the movement in the network, a lot of basic reporting, dashboarding, that kind of capability. But our latest innovations are taking us into something we're calling orchestration, which is using a lot more data and AI-driven platforms to help us detect potential disruptions in the network before they occur, and often many, many days before they occur, collaborate virtually, and then deploy a solution to the extent one is warranted. Sometimes you look at something that may look like a concern from a assurance of supply standpoint, and realize, no, you know what, the network's going to be fine. We don't have to respond. We don't have to do anything. In other cases, you realize, no, this really does have risk of creating an outage. What's the best response? And we all know the more time you have, the more options you have, and the better your response can be. So that you've talked to Debbie about a lot of that, but that's really one of the newest areas of focus for Armada on the tech side. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, broad base of logistics capabilities. That's really the roots of the business. We invented redistribution in the food service space over 30 years ago and have grown that business significantly. We handle about 80 million cases annually across all temp zones, core product, promotional product, a lot of imported items with redistribution and general warehousing and storage programs. Then we also manage transportation, as I mentioned. So those are the real, I would say, workhorses inside the business. And then we have a whole services component to what we can do. Everything from engineering and network design capabilities, helping you align supply to last mile distribution to your restaurants, or helping you align distribution to your manufacturing facilities or your end customers. A lot of professional services around project management, process transformation. And then probably the most unique thing we do is we have a whole suite of financial services. Fuel hedging being a very obvious one, especially given the transportation that we manage. But we will make inventory investments on behalf of clients. We have some very unique ways to help manage the deployment of pricing in the network. So you may want a nationally average priced category or program, and we can help you manage that without losing visibility to the actual costs of the transportation and logistics underneath that. So there's a whole suite of capabilities on the financial side, which is very unique, especially versus what you may find. We will almost act as your bank, which is you don't find very often in the supply chain space.
And you all will have boots on the ground with your clients as well, right?
Yeah. So my team, the national accounts team, as well as there's another division that is specific to one account. So my folks, where possible and where it works for the restaurant brand, will be resided in the geography where the brand is based, where the support center is, as an example. And our folks will, when we were all going into the office every day, my folks would go into that office on a daily basis to be right there with the supply chain team. So we're almost an insourced partner to you, helping you run the supply chain. And we just creates a ton of value for both organizations because we get to really know the business on the day to day. We're part of the fabric of the organization. We're right there when meetings come up or challenges come up, and we can just be right in the mix of helping you solve them. So it's been a great model for us.
Are you saying there's challenges in the food supply chain?
Occasionally.
Right. So a couple things before again, folks, we want to talk about transportation and logistics today. And in kind of the Pittsburgh culture, humble fashion, mm-hmm. Armada really doesn't talk about their customers, but it's fair to say that Armada mostly does business with some of the biggest restaurant chains in the world. Is that fair?
We do business with some of the biggest brands, all very household names. We help manage the inbound supply chain for 30% of the NRN 200. So the nation's, it's now the Technomic ranking, but what used to be branded more as the nation's restaurant news ranking. So we're about 30% of them. If you look at a sales basis, and many brands in the top 25 of that list. But we can support you anywhere in that continuum. But the big ones are really where we've spent a lot of time, and in many cases we started with them when they weren't big. So we've helped them grow.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And one of the things that's been, I got to be honest with you folks, and this probably came out when I talked to Debbie back in the spring, but what I've been very impressed with is their knowledge of the supply chain and the best practices, because they are doing business with so many large supply chains.
Right.
That I would argue, I think they understand the supply chain better than a lot of supply chain teams throughout the country, just because they get kind of best, they can they learn from everybody, whereas supply chain teams have a tendency to be siloed.
Right. Yeah, we definitely, obviously with all the right guardrails and care, do try and move best practices across our client environments, or simply introduce the best practice to all of them. You know, the other thing I would say we've benefited from is many times those clients can have a very unique supply chain challenge. And because we have such a track record with them of solving problems that no one else can quite figure out how to solve, they often come to us with the challenge and say, how would you solve this? What do you think the best way is to achieve this goal or mitigate this risk in my network? And we'll design a very tailored, almost bespoke solution for that one brand. Work it and try it out in real time. And as we learn from it, then determine how best to commercialize it and take it out to the rest of the industry.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so before we jump into here, transportation and logistics, can you mentioned the term 3PL earlier. Can you define that for everybody?
Sure. So there's a 3PL versus a 4PL. So Armada really acts as a 4PL. But 3PL first is a third-party logistics provider. That is someone to whom you have outsourced some operation of your supply chain, warehousing and transportation being probably the two most frequent and obvious examples. So in a 3PL relationship, you're going to contract as the restaurant brand directly with that warehouse provider or with that transportation provider and say, here, manage forward storage of French fries in my network for me in these geographies. Manage the transportation from here to here in these geographies. Even the last mile distribution relationships, those are 3PL relationships. And there are many unique things, but a great distinction about the multi-unit food service space is their supply chains are essentially outsourced. Unlike, say, retail or manufacturing, where those companies are owning certainly everything from last mile distribution into, say, a retail outlet, or even further upstream of that into raw material. With some exceptions, there are some companies out there that do own a big piece of that logistics. You see it a lot as an example in the pizza category, but that's not the typical operating model. So those are 3PL relationships. We say we come in as a 4PL in that we don't necessarily have to operate the truck or operate the warehouse. We help you manage all those relationships on your behalf and really act as an extension of the brand to ensure that your goals and strategy are really being deployed the most effectively across the organization, across the network, and everyone is adhering to all those practices and policies. And most importantly, collaborating together. A lot of times what happens when you do have this level of outsourcing in the network, folks are making very localized decisions just with the information they have available to them at their node or on their lane. We can sit over top of all of that, see the network end to end, and help all the network stakeholders make the best decision for the brand, which might not be the decision any one node would come to on their own.
Yeah. Okay. And give us an example of redistribution.
Yeah. So redistribution is the consolidation of low volume, often moving LTL, less than truckload product in the network, and you consolidate that into geographically optimal locations. The redistribution provider then buys full truckload quantities from suppliers, brings that product in and warehouses it in those one or more locations. And then the distributors order from the redistribution company a mixed truckload that could have 20, 30, 40 unique SKUs on it, and brings that consolidated truck inbound to their center. You can do it across multiple temp zones. There's some variance on how you design the program. There's even variance in how you deploy it. If for a smaller brand or someone who's more maybe not very geographically consolidated, like very much like, say, a southern U.S. or a West Coast, you may be able to simply use your last mile distribution provider in one of their centers to operate a RED program on your behalf. So there's a sort of continuum and evolution of how redistribution looks in a restaurant brand supply chain, depending on the size of the brand, the geographical fragmentation of either your restaurant locations or your last mile locations, or just simply what the supply chain strategy of the brand may be. I hear a lot, well, we don't like to use redistribution, it's too expensive. It's like, well, it does have a cost. You have to pay the service provider to do this work. But at the end of the day, every case that flows through that channel should net out to saving you $1 in logistics cost over allowing it to ship in the way it has been shipped. So you can pay for all the transportation, pay for the warehousing, pay the provider, and still save yourself $1 a case.
And so the other options would be either you have less than truckload quantities going into your last mile distributor like Cisco or Sigma,
Right.
US Foodservice, etc.
Right.
Or they're taking truckloads of product that's not going to move.
That's not
and they're going to charge you more. They're going to charge you more on that product.
Right. And we're probably going to talk about this in a little bit, but last mile capacity is highly constrained. It got very constrained during COVID and has really not eased. So oftentimes those last mile distributors don't want to hold that kind of stock for you, even if you're paying them and giving them a return on it. They make money when they are rotating and turning product through that building at a fairly high velocity. So if they have some excess space, they'll certainly do it, but it's not as reliable a solution as a third party running a more nationwide network for you that's really designed to best support your restaurants.
Yeah, we'll talk about that more in a minute, but the leverage has shifted in the supply chain.
It has, and I'm not sure it's going to shift back anytime.
No, it's too expensive.
Yeah,
it's too expensive to expand. Okay, so and then real quick before we jump in, Armada has, and I think we talked about this with Debbie, but just in case people didn't listen to that episode, maybe quick. Armada has an interesting history. This is an old company.
It is. So the company goes back to the late 1800s. Started in Pittsburgh. A family by the name of Hoffman had a line of retail pork products. They were a pork processing business that had a retail line. Through some interesting connections, they ultimately had an opportunity inside the McDonald's system. One of the local McDonald's franchisees, the inventor, happened to be the inventor of the Big Mac, also invented and was the first to start selling breakfast out of McDonald's locations. And the Hoffman family was providing him with sausage to make the sausage patties for the breakfast sandwiches. That ultimately led to a relationship with McDonald's and the creation of what became Northside Foods, which owns the patent on the partially cooked frozen sausage patty. So for anyone who has enjoyed a breakfast sandwich that has a frozen sausage patty, or what was a frozen sausage patty on it, regardless of the brand, you can thank the Hoffman family for that invention. And it was that brought us into food service and then ultimately led to the redistribution work that we did.
And the inventor of the Big Mac and And the breakfast at McDonald's is in the Pittsburgh area?
He was in the Pittsburgh area, yes.
All right. I love that story.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So a Yinzer invented the Big Mac.
Yes, he did. And
yes,
can also thank him for breakfast at McDonald's.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah. I tell my business partner at Pastry all the time. It always comes back to Pittsburgh. Always. All right, great. And by the way, folks, Steelers had a pretty good win yesterday. I got to get that in now because I know how long that's going to last.
Yep.
All right, cool. So we're here to talk about logistics. You just mentioned a second ago that that capacity has become much tighter in the distribution business, and maybe before just in case there's somebody listening, maybe walk us through for these chains how the supply chain works from the manufacturer supplier, possibly into redistribution to the distributor, and then to the stores, and why.
Sure. And maybe that angle I'll take on it, especially for, a restaurant brand starting out in the very early phases of growth. You have 20, 50, 100 locations. You're probably using one of the big, what would be called broadline distribution companies. You're using a Cisco, a US Foods, a PFG, or similar. And the reason you're using them is you're not at the scale yet to be doing a lot of direct contracting of proprietary product. You're not going to have your own chicken breast spec or your own French fry spec. You basically need a grocery store from which to buy products to support your restaurants, and that's what those broadline distributors enable for you. That's why they exist. That's why they're so successful, and they serve a very important niche, if you will, in the restaurant brand space, in addition to their, just street business of the local mom and pop. But as these restaurant brands grow and they have more leverage and more scale, they realize, I can and I do want to start having proprietary products that can only be sold to my restaurant because that gives me some competitive menu advantage. And I'm going to contract a price and a certain volume. Well, those broadline distributors, coming back to capacity, if they're already carrying 20 different French fry items, they don't necessarily want to carry a 21st. So that begins, you start to see a shift then to saying, okay, it's time for me to move beyond the broadline distributor and go to a more custom environment. And that's where you see the PFG custom side, the McLean custom side, Gordon Foodservice, a lot of the distributors you see under the DMA umbrella. So that you sort of enter into that next phase of network design around last mile distribution, and you're aligning the suppliers through which you've procured and contracted this product with those distributors. So the distributors are now going to buy these products on your behalf, warehouse them, slot them, and then pick and make all the deliveries ultimately to the restaurant. Now, the third phase, which you will see in some environments, you can have a captive network where it's still a third party providing distribution, but you essentially have commitment from that provider that they're solely going to run your business out of their warehouse. And obviously, you need a lot of scale to be able to support that. And also, that's where you see folks owning that leg of distribution, as I talked about, say with pizza. It's an example where you see that.
Okay, great. All right. And so, again, distribution capacity has tightened. Why?
A few things. Probably the biggest one is, we all know the restaurant industry is hyper competitive. We're not creating year over year growth in consumers in this country. We're a pretty flat population growth. So if you want to increase your market share, you have to steal customers from somebody else. And oftentimes the way the food service industry does that is they have a limited time offer or some kind of a promoted product to create interest and bring new people in. Well, that has created a significant amount of skew proliferation, individual item proliferation, many more things to be stocked, creating challenges in the last mile network. They only have so many slots in a warehouse. Those warehouses are only so big. So the more items you're asking them to carry on your behalf, they have to have space for that. So that has been one of the biggest drivers, particularly pre-COVID. Now, as we've come through COVID and capacity got really constrained because products stopped moving, especially for certain segments of the industry, casual dining, fine dining, really saw significant sales decreases during COVID, whereas anyone with a drive-through couldn't keep product, had a hard time keeping product in stock. That we saw that capacity tightening in the network, and that has really that has persisted even post-COVID. So yeah, as you said, the tables have turned, and it's really now the last mile providers that have more of the upper hand, and being able to either say, look, I'm happy to support your business, but I don't have this amount of space for you. Or we see them being very selective with the business they choose to keep and resigning business, saying, I can't support you in this geography. I'll support you for a period until you can find an alternative, but I can't be your ongoing provider here.
Yeah, and I don't know if you can speak to this, but from prior guests, rates have gone up quite a bit too. They're increasing rates, distribution, and so my experience pre-COVID, well before COVID, was that the restaurant chains, when they needed to find margin, would do a distribution RFP, right? And they would try to drive costs down in their distribution. Which they can't do anymore. Costs
they can't
are going
do, up. And I don't know that they really ever could do.
Yeah.
One of the things that's really at the core of how Armada operates is where we think transparency between trading partners is the most important thing. Transparency of costs, transparency of service levels, and there was a period. I always joke, everything else in our lives gets more expensive. And yet, if you're someone responsible for procuring last mile distribution, your performance goal is you're going to somehow procure it cheaper than it was last year. That's really not feasible, especially post-COVID, where with all the inflation and everything else that we have seen. So how do you have the right conversations with any of your providers, but I think in particular your last mile ones, about what is really the cost of doing for you to do business to support my brand? And then let's have a conversation about my willingness or ability to pay that cost, and then the margin on top of that. And there's lots of ways you can help your last mile distributors gain margin, backhauling product into their centers, making them more efficient in the operations inside their building, making them more efficient at the point of restaurant delivery. Spend a lot more energy creating those solutions than just simply trying to negotiate the price of a case.
Yeah.
Because there just isn't really a lot of room to negotiate there anymore. And ultimately what any supply chain provider wants, they want efficiency in their operations, because that naturally drives cost out. So help them be more efficient, find out what it is about your supply chain that makes them less efficient, and see if there aren't creative ways to solve it.
So something like that might be off-hour deliveries when nobody's there.
Right. Key drop deliveries. Or on the other end of the spectrum, we have clients who have assisted deliveries. So the delivery does happen during restaurant operating hours, or maybe in the morning when there is staff there doing prep work, but the restaurant's not open. And they have a person on staff that is going to assist that driver in getting that product in and unloaded, so that the driver is spending the minimum amount of time at that stop. That driver and that truck are the most expensive assets inside a food service supply chain, no matter what you look at. The more efficient you can make them, the greater the impact on your fee, and you'll just have a happier supplier. That driver will be happier, and they'll provide, by their very nature, you'll get You'll get better service. They'll be more interested in supporting your business. So there's lots of ways you can go about it, but definitely conversations you should be having with your distributors.
Yeah, that is one of the most I think, or can be one of the most overlooked relationships in the entire supply chain.
Yes.
Is the driver to the store.
Yes.
Because those drivers can fix problems very quickly if they're motivated to do so. Right.
Yep.
So I know at Pastry Yard, our restaurant, any drivers that come, even a FedEx driver, they want something to eat or drink, we feed them.
Absolutely.
They need to use the bathroom, they use it, whatever. Right. They're part of our team.
Yeah.
Right. Because I know there's going to be a time where they forget something on their truck, and it's their decision if they bring it to us or not.
Right.
Right. And it could be something we need.
Yeah. And it's those very simple acts of hospitality with the driver. We're all in the hospitality business, even those in the supply chain. And you look at, even providing those same kind of services and amenities to drivers who are coming into your warehouse or into your plant.
Great point.
Give them a break room, give them internet access, give them even just someplace, even if it's a vending machine, something, I can get a drink, I can get a snack. I have access to a clean restroom. They sound like such simple things, but you would be amazed at the number of facilities out there that don't offer those things.
Yeah.
And if a driver isn't happy going into a particular location to pick up or drop off product, that's going to reflect in your service and in your cost.
Yep. So it just cued a thought of myself being in redistribution back in the mid 90s, early 90s. One of the drivers got upset and just literally left the truck on the side of the road, called his buddy, and that was it. That was it. Yeah.
And that happened
and
more
we
than
were scrambling. Yeah, we were scrambling looking for Anyways, well, so I think that's a good. I think it's, and we're going to talk about this more in a second, but it's a good segue into transportation space. But let's. I don't want to pass over the fact of how hard of a job it is to be a driver, whether that's into a warehouse, whether that's into a restaurant. I just at Pastry Yard, we have an alley. It can back up for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
So it is not an easy job.
No, it is not.
I do want to touch on one more thing in distribution that we're seeing, and that's skew rationalization. So you mentioned that that the capacity is tightened. Part of that was been driven by LTOs, which if you watch TV and you look at the ads, those aren't going away.
Right.
Those are because the industry, particularly in the state of the restaurant industry right now, is challenged, right, for traffic, and they're going to try to drive traffic.
Right.
But the distributors are starting to rationalize or starting to reduce those, we call them SKUs, but maybe number of products that they might offer. How does that impact the supply chain? I mean, now for most of the big restaurant chains, there would be proprietary products, but they would still buy off of that. Some,
yes.
Yeah.
And, there's always that tail of items that probably will never be proprietary, where if I can leverage a distributor's trash liner or napkin or straw, I should really be looking at that. Like when I go to any restaurant, multi-unit restaurant, I'm not going there because of the napkin or the straw. I just want to know they have them, but it doesn't need to be branded. It doesn't have to be in their color. I just want them. So, look for those opportunities where you can just buy off. Even the custom houses have have their sort of line of products, especially in those areas. Cleaning products, another great example, where they don't have to carry, they don't have to slot an additional type of straw just for you. That you're just, and then they can bring that product in truckload. It moves through their building a lot faster. It's not taking up extra space. So all of those opportunities are real, and you should really be talking to your distributor about, like, what can I take advantage of that you are already stocking, and where is there commonality that I can tap into?
Yeah. Put your ego at the door.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. sometimes it's tough to do.
Yes.
So let's talk about now transportation logistics. And again, before we dive in, let's remind everyone how broad that can be, right? How your customers have taken you all over the world for that, right?
And they have. Big portion of our business is domestic, continuous U.S. Truckload transportation. Part of the reason it's mostly truckload is because through the redistribution efforts we take almost all of the less than truckload movements out of the network because they're costly, they're inefficient, service is poor, you don't know an appointment for an LTL driver. You might know the day they're going to show up, but you don't have an appointment. So it's very disruptive to warehouse operation. So as a result of leveraging redistribution to take all that noise out of the network, the vast majority of the transportation that we support for our clients domestically is truckload over the road. We do also, intermodal is always a great option, but from a cost standpoint, and then also from a sustainability standpoint. One intermodal container is the equivalent, one rail container is the equivalent of about 3 truckloads. But even moving intermodal, it's just a more carbon efficient and fuel efficient way to move product across, especially long distances. There are definitely lanes and channels through which intermodal is a good option. Then in addition to that, as I mentioned, especially with the ATEC acquisition, we support a lot of export and import of product for our clients, either product being sourced in China or Mexico that needs to come into the U.S. to support restaurant operations here, or using product made here to export out to restaurants in other parts of the world.
Cool. Great. And so what's the state of let's just start with the trucking industry in the United States. I mean, rates are off their highs from during COVID. Mm-hmm. And maybe trying to stabilize, but haven't really rebounded much.
No, still haven't rebounded. Again, depending on your perspective. If you're the carrier, you're wishing they would go back up. And if you're the shipper, you're really happy where they are right now.
Yeah.
The U.S. over-the-road truckload transportation market is a highly, highly fragmented industry. No one makes price in transportation. There's just too many providers. Something like 95% of truckload carriers in the U.S. have less than 20 trucks. So highly, highly fragmented, which is part of the reason why the whole brokerage community exists, but very, very long tail of providers. Now, on the opposite side of that, about 4% of the truckload carriers in the U.S. handle 64% of the volume. So you have really big and then a lot of small, and then some in between. So highly fragmented market. So as a result, the price you pay for transportation, whether you're contracting a rate on a lane for some period or you're riding the spot market, which is just, I have a load to move, and a carrier will say, I'll take that load if you're willing to pay this price. That market is cyclical, and it will always be cyclical. It's supply and demand driven, very much informed by what the economy is doing. So if the consumer is going gangbusters, and there's a lot of demand for goods, then the demand for shipping goes up and carriers can command more of a price. The consumer isn't doing as well. They're not going out to eat. They're not buying things. There's some excess capacity in the transportation market. Lots of people willing to move your load. So then the shipper has a little bit more leverage to say, this is the price I'm willing to pay. So we are still in a shipper cycle. All the forecasts and economists we pay attention to saying sometime in 2025 that market will turn. They are forecasting truckload rate increases anywhere from 4 to 5% if you're contracting, or 7 to 8% if you're going to stay on the spot market. But it'll be probably one more month before they really start to get a little more confident in what those forecasts are. what the economy does is a huge impact on that forecast. We're in an election year. That always creates uncertainty, which makes forecasting harder. And then even just you add the broader, just ongoing geopolitical challenges, and which creates something of a nervous consumer. And consumer behavior ultimately determines the supply and demand cycles, and then that trickles down into rates.
And those geopolitical issues can also impact international.
100%. I mean, you look at what's going on in the Middle East and how shipping through the Red Sea is threatened, and a lot of carriers are no longer using that channel, and they're taking their ships around the southern coast of Africa, which lengthens transit. I think it's 4 to 5 days, if memory serves. That's one thing. But the other thing is now you have that capacity, those containers and those ships tied up for longer periods. So it's tightening capacity as well.
Yeah. What are the best practices around transportation as a whole, would you say? Like, what do you think? So, I mean, if we could kind of set the table, if you introduced that small restaurant chain, 20 to 50 units at the beginning of the podcast, if they're buying from the distributor's managing most of that transportation, but we likely will have people on this, listen to this, who might be working for a distributor and doing exactly that. So somebody's got to manage that freight. Right. Those logistics. So what are some of the best practices you've seen across the industry? Maybe start domestic, and if you have anything on international or cross-border, that would be cool too.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with domestic. There's a couple, and I would say there are some that are very much in a state of evolution as we speak. The biggest one being, the whole procurement philosophy, if you will. Leading up to COVID and even a little bit in COVID, the procurement goal was, I'm going to procure capacity on a lane for a year at a price, and I'm just going to let that lane run for its year. I'm going to do an annual bid. Typically in food, you see a lot of that happen late in the year or early in Q1. That's when a lot of food shippers are going out to bid. So as an example, that's often when we go to bid, because you want those carriers looking at the whole set of transportation available to them, because they're going to do a lot of work as carriers to try and line up, this shipper has a lane that goes from here to here, and this shipper has a lane that'll get me out of that geography and take me somewhere else. The more they can create almost those continuous moves in their network, it's very hard to do, but they certainly try and get them as good as they can. Everyone in that move will get a little bit of a benefit on the rate side. So that historically has been how truckload procurement operated. What folks are starting to look at, and we're actively engaged in a research project currently with MIT's Center for Transportation and Logistics. For anyone who's procuring transportation, if you don't follow Chris Caplice, that's Caplice, foremost sort of researcher in truckload transportation procurement, tons of knowledge. We're looking at, and this is born out of some of his research, taking more of a portfolio approach to procuring truckload transportation. So just like you would say, segment your items, you have your A core items, center of the plate, critical product. If it's not there, you're not selling anything to your customer. Then you have everything all the way at the opposite end of the spectrum that you could run the restaurant without. Like if you ran out of trash can liners, operationally it's a headache, but you can still figure out how to get around that and serve food. And then you have items that sort of fall in the middle. So based on that, the segmentation of those items, you can procure transportation very differently across those segments. The things that are lower volume that you can run, that you may only see a truckload every other week, maybe only once a month. Those probably make a lot more sense just to ride the spot market. Whereas things you've got multiple truckloads a week or a month, you probably want to contract that and get an asset-based carrier on that lane at an agreed upon price with agreed upon service levels, and ensure you're going to have the reliability of that transportation because those items are so core to how you operate. So that is something that we're actively engaged in looking at as a way to advance how we procure, but also, a little bit more where the market is going. So that's one, I think, that just broad-based, we're seeing a lot of shippers starting to evaluate where and how that can make sense. Another best practice that I would say is really sort of a sweet spot for Armada is around collaboration. We have a team of folks we call field services. Some folks internally call them our secret weapon. And they're kind of Switzerland in the supply chain, and they take all the data we sit on and our network trading partners sit on, and they really understand what is the performance in the network, how is this lane performing from an on-time standpoint, and if it's not on time with some regularity, why not? What's the underlying behavior or business practice that is causing this to be a challenge? And then they'll get all those stakeholders at a table and we'll figure out how to root cause solve it. So a great example of that is what in the business is called dwell time, which is how long the driver sits at that location waiting to be loaded or unloaded. Greg, coming back to Chris Kaplis, in times of tight capacity is when you'll hear a lot of headlines around driver shortages.
Yeah.
His viewpoint is it's not so much that we have a driver shortage problem, we have a transportation inefficiency. If you could lower the dwell time by 10 minutes per load, there would be no driver shortage. It's just, it's inefficiency of their time. It's not a lack of drivers and trucks. So we spend a lot of time looking at, in collaboration, where are we seeing excess dwell, which one drives detention cost, which typically is $60 an hour after the first hour. And how do we take that inefficiency out of the network? And as a result, you take cost out of the network. So the American Transport Research Institute released a study recently that at least in refrigerated and frozen truckload transportation, the average dwell time is 100 minutes, so an hour and 40 minutes. You're paying detention on the 40 minutes. Usually you get an hour free. In our network, the average is 64 minutes because we have worked so diligently with the trading partners to improve processes so you can turn those drivers faster. And the result of that, one, you're not paying detention. So let's just say on average, you're saving $40 a load. If you have 10,000 loads in your network, that's $400,000 a year just in detention costs that you're not spending. And then because that carrier knows that truck is going to move efficiently, if a driver is sitting, a driver and a truck are not making money. So if they know that that's really going to be an efficient lane for them, you're going to get a slightly better rate from them. They want to move that lane because it's good for them. So it pays benefits in lots of ways. So we have a team of 12 people in our business, and that's all they do. And they more than deliver ROI, both for us, but also for our clients.
Interesting. Yeah. Great stuff. Great stuff. All right. And maybe we kind of wind down here. Something I'm not sure a lot of people think about, but there is a sustainability component to use the term network earlier to the entire supply chain, whether that's, maybe you can talk about some of the best practices around sustainability and lowering emissions, whether that's at the distributor, but probably more so in the transportation network.
Yeah, I can talk in transportation. There are some things we're doing in our warehouses too that I can speak to. So from a transportation standpoint, the example I just talked through with reducing dwell time, and you don't have that truck sitting there idling for 40 more minutes than it needs to be. That's a great example. We in our network, we are aligned with a U.S. EPA program called SmartWay. We require all our carriers to be SmartWay certified. And what the SmartWay program is doing is it's advising the transportation industry in how to be more efficient in their operations to reduce emissions and the carbon impact of transportation, which is significant. So they help bring, for anyone who's driving down a road and you see a tractor trailer and you may see the extended cab at the top that basically elevates the top of the cab to being even with the top of the trailer. Or you may see the skirts along the sides between the wheelbases. Or sometimes you may see fins on the back that are kind of extruding from the tailgate. All of those things are reducing the air drag on the equipment and making them more fuel efficient. That's one of the that's one of the recommendations that the SmartWay program recommends. They can help you deploy. They've got a lot of the study and statistics around what the fuel efficiency impact is, and as a result, how you can then report that as a carbon improvement. Because all of us are also looking at ways we can really validate that the environmental improvements we're making are truly having a carbon impact. So those are a couple examples on the transportation side. The other one I mentioned earlier is wherever possible, use the last mile distributor's return route to bring product back to the last mile facility. The truck is going back there anyway. Even if you're only picking up a few pallets, it's still, one, it's very cost effective, but it's also helping you at least make that transportation move productive and reduce the need then for an additional move to just get that product from point A to point B. In the area of redistribution, because of, you're bringing full truckloads in of a handful of products and then sending out these very mixed loads that could have 20, 30, 40 items on them, as I mentioned, because of that mix effect on the outbound truck, for every 10 trucks of product that come into a redistribution facility, you only need 9 trucks to get all that product outbound again. So there's a network efficiency purely in moving the product through Redi, in addition to the fact that anytime you can make a truck as full as possible when you move it, you get the best efficiency out of that move, as opposed to moving something LTL or just less full. So Redi can have that transportation effect as well.
Great. And Armada has an emissions goal, right?
We do. I am not the most well versed at all of those details, because it is all it's very complex and very technical. But we did sign a carbon pledge. We do have carbon emission goals, and are working towards them. Because we don't own trucks, we're really working with our carrier relationships and understanding what they're doing. And that's also why we've signed on to the EPA SmartWay program. Inside our warehouses, there's a lot we can do and have done. 2 of our buildings are LEED certified, so and built to environmental efficiency standards. That's our facility in Pennsylvania, and the new facility we just opened late last year in outside of Dallas, Texas. Our buildings are ISO 14001 certified, which is an environmental certification that says we are doing all these right things. And if you look up ISO 14001, it'll sort of give you the requirements and the things it's helping you manage. But the certification is saying Armada is doing all of these things to reduce its environmental impact from operations. And those could be energy efficiency gains. We've done some work with the efficiency of the chiller units for our refrigeration and frozen capacity inside our buildings. We are zero waste to landfill in our buildings. They're all LED lighting with motion detector. So there's a lot of things that we've looked at and deployed to try and become more energy efficient and sustainable. And there's two aspects of that. The sustainability is important. We all want to have less of an impact on this earth and on the environment, but there's a cost savings too. All of those things I just mentioned are improving our cost of operations as well.
Yeah, so it's a win-win. Is it fair to say, I think a lot of businesses may say, okay, I want to look at my carbon footprint. I'm going to go immediately back to the farm. And that's really tough, slow progress.
Yes.
As people might be able to tell from some of the prior episodes. But there might be some low-hanging fruit in this space. I'm not saying it's incredibly easy to do, but maximizing your network and participating in some of these things that you all are doing to lower your carbon footprint rather quickly. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the best things you can do, and we work very diligently on our clients' behalf to do this, is just making sure the trucks are full.
Yeah.
If there's some kind of minimum order quantity, or we'll help clients determine what's the economic order quantity, like what is the most cost-effective mix and use of this truck. And then we'll actively monitor the orders being placed, whether it's us ordering product into redistribution or it's the distributor ordering from the supplier. And we will make sure that everyone's adhering to what those minimums are, so that when the truck moves, you're really getting the best, not just a great sustainability and carbon improvement, but again, you're saving money. You're paying for that truck to move from point A to point B, regardless of how much is on it. Get as much product on it as you can that the downstream network can also support, because you have to balance it too. You can't just fill the truck up and expect your distributor to hold, 40 pallets of cup carriers when they don't need them or don't have room for them, or they're going to sit there for too long. So you have to balance all of those levers, which is why we call it an economic order quantity rather than just a straight minimum order quantity, which is probably a supplier minimum. Like you have to pick up at least 4 pallets, or it's too much work for me to process this order. This takes a broader view of it.
Great. Well, Lorraine, I want to thank you for being on the show. Fascinating.
Thanks for having me, David. Great to catch up with you always.
And that brings us to the end of another insightful journey through the fields of innovation on Farm to Fork, the Innovators. It's an honor to have you listen. If you found today's episode as fascinating as we did, don't forget to share it with a friend, write a review, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another episode. Farm to Fork is not just a podcast. It's a community of forward thinkers and change makers. Your thoughts and ideas matter to us. Reach out on social media or through our website, datumfs.com, and be a part of the ongoing conversation. As we wrap up today, remember, the future of the food supply chain is in our hands. Stay curious, stay innovative, and let's continue growing together. Until next time, this is David Maloney signing off from Farm to Fork, the Innovators. Thank you for being a part of this community. See you in the next episode.